Rebecca Martinez struggled with the simplest tasks. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her combat boots for the third time that morning, the laces slipping through her fingers like water. The other recruits had already finished dressing and were heading to the mess hall, their confident footsteps echoing down the corridor. Rebecca sat on her bunk, staring at her feet, wondering how someone who couldn't manage basic bootlaces had ended up at the most elite military training facility in the country. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What her drill instructor would discover in her locker 3 weeks later would change everything anyone thought they knew about the quiet woman who seemed so out of place among America's finest warriors. The morning mist hung heavy over Camp Davidson as Rebecca Martinez stepped off the transport bus, her duffel bag weighing down her shoulder. The sprawling military installation stretched across the Virginia countryside, its imposing buildings and meticulously maintained grounds designed to intimidate new arrivals. Rebecca clutched her orders with sweaty palms, reading her assignment for the dozenth time. Special Forces Assessment and Selection Course, Class 47B. She didn't belong here. That much was obvious from the moment she joined the other candidates gathering near the administration building. These were specimens of human athleticism, broad shoulders, confident postures, and eyes that had already seen combat. Rebecca, barely 5'4", with gentle features and soft-spoken demeanor, looked like she had wandered into the wrong place entirely. Master Sergeant David Coleman stood before the group of 37 candidates, his weathered face scanning each person with the precision of a sniper's scope. 23 years in the Army had given him an almost supernatural ability to read people within minutes of meeting them. As his gaze settled on Rebecca, he felt a familiar knot form in his stomach, the one that appeared whenever he knew someone was about to quit. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the hardest 8 weeks of your military careers," Coleman's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "By the time we're done here, most of you will be on a bus home, questioning every decision that led you to this moment. This isn't basic training. This isn't an advanced infantry school. This is where we separate the elite from the merely excellent." Rebecca shifted nervously, her gear feeling heavier with each word. She had barely passed the preliminary fitness requirements, scraping by with times that put her in the bottom 5th percentile. Her marksmanship scores were adequate but unremarkable. Her tactical knowledge came entirely from textbooks rather than experience. On paper, she was the least qualified candidate in the group. The first week proved even more challenging than she had anticipated. While other candidates tackled the obstacle course with fluid precision, Rebecca struggled over every wall, through every crawl space, across every rope bridge. Her hands, soft from years of desk work, blistered and bled within the first 2 days. Simple tasks that others completed instinctively, field stripping weapons, reading topographical maps, executing basic tactical maneuvers, required her full concentration and multiple attempts. But it was the morning routine that truly highlighted her difficulties. Every dawn brought the same humiliating ritual. While her bunkmates dressed and prepared their gear with military efficiency, Rebecca wrestled with her boots. The double knots that were supposed to stay secure throughout 12-hour training days came undone within hours. Her laces would loosen during runs, causing her to fall behind the group as she stopped to retie them. During tactical exercises, loose boots meant twisted ankles and lost footing at crucial moments. Master Sergeant Coleman watched these struggles with growing frustration. In his experience, candidates who couldn't handle basic tasks rarely lasted beyond the second week. He had seen talented soldiers wash out because they lacked attention to detail, and Rebecca's boot situation seemed to epitomize a deeper problem with discipline and preparation. "Martinez," he called during a particularly difficult navigation exercise, "your left boot is untied again." Rebecca licked down, her cheeks flushing red as she noticed the trailing lace. Around her, the other candidates maintained their positions, waiting as she knelt to retie for the 4th time that morning. The delay cost their entire squad precious minutes on an already challenging course. Private First Class Tommy Brennan, a former college football player from Texas, shook his head in visible frustration. "Come on, Martinez, we're all getting smoked because you can't tie your boots." Rebecca's fingers worked clumsily with the laces, the pressure of 26 pairs of eyes making her movements even more awkward. She had tried different lacing techniques, watched YouTube tutorials on her phone during rare free moments, even practiced in the bathroom after lights out. Nothing seemed to work. The whispers started during the second week. Other candidates questioned how she had even qualified for the course. Some speculated about political correctness and quota systems. Others wondered if she was someone's daughter or niece, riding on connections rather than merit. Rebecca heard every word, felt every judgmental stare, and internalized every doubt they expressed about her presence. Master Sergeant Coleman found himself in an uncomfortable position. His job was to identify and develop elite soldiers, not to nursemaid struggling recruits. He had dismissed dozens of candidates over the years for far less obvious deficiencies. Yet something about Rebecca puzzled him. Despite her obvious struggles, she never quit. When others complained about impossible training standards, she simply tried harder. When exhaustion brought grown men to tears, she maintained her composure and pressed forward. During the third week, the course shifted to urban warfare scenarios. Candidates moved through mock city environments, clearing buildings and responding to simulated threats. Rebecca's performance remained consistently below average, but Coleman noticed something interesting in her decision-making. While other candidates relied on aggression and overwhelming force, she approached each scenario with unusual thoughtfulness. Her tactical solutions were unconventional but often effective. In one exercise, her squad was tasked with rescuing hostages from a building occupied by enemy forces. The standard approach involved breaching the main entrance and overwhelming the defenders through superior firepower. Rebecca suggested an alternative, creating a distraction at the front while a smaller team infiltrate through the building's service tunnels. Her plan worked flawlessly, achieving the objective with minimal simulated casualties. "Interesting approach, Martinez," Coleman commented afterward. "Where did you learn tunnel warfare tactics?" Rebecca's response was characteristically modest. "I read about it in a manual, Sergeant. Seemed logical." But Coleman's instincts told him there was more to the story. Her tactical knowledge went beyond what any manual could teach. She understood urban environments in ways that suggested real experience, not theoretical study. Her suggestions during planning sessions often demonstrated familiarity with equipment and procedures that weren't part of standard military training. The mystery deepened during weapons training. While Rebecca struggled with basic marksmanship, she displayed an unusual familiarity with specialized equipment. When an instructor brought out a sniper rifle for demonstration purposes, she instinctively adjusted the scope and identified wind compensation factors that impressed even the rangemaster. Yet, when asked about her experience with precision shooting, she claimed to have none. As the fourth week approached, Rebecca remained the weakest performer in measurable categories. Her run times were the slowest, her obstacle course performance the most labored, her equipment maintenance the most error-prone. The morning boot-tying ritual had become a daily source of embarrassment that seemed to symbolize all her inadequacies. Other candidates had begun to treat her with a mixture of pity and resentment. Pity because her struggles were obvious to everyone, and resentment because her presence potentially compromised their own chances of success. In a course where candidates were evaluated both individually and as team members, having a weak link could affect everyone's prospects. Master Sergeant Coleman faced a decision. Standard protocol suggested removing Rebecca from the course before she dragged down other candidates or injured herself during increasingly dangerous training scenarios. Her file showed no prior combat experience, no special qualifications, and performance metrics that placed her in the bottom 10% of all candidates he had trained. Yet, something held him back from making the obvious choice. Perhaps it was her unwavering determination, or the quiet dignity with which she faced daily humiliation. Maybe it was the tactical insights that seemed to come from nowhere, Or the way she never complained despite having every reason to do so? The answer to his confusion was waiting in her locker, locked away behind a combination that only Rebecca knew. But Master Sergeant Coleman wouldn't discover it for another week, and when he did, it would force him to reconsider everything he thought he knew about identifying elite soldiers. The 5th week brought survival training deep in the Appalachian wilderness. Candidates were dropped in teams of 4 at coordinates scattered across 50 square miles of dense forest, equipped with minimal gear and tasked with reaching an extraction point within 72 hours. For most, it would be their first real test of everything they had learned. For Rebecca Martinez, it would be a revelation. Rebecca found herself paired with Tommy Brennan, the frustrated football player from Texas, along with Marcus Chen, a former Marine from California, and Sarah Williams, an Army Ranger from Georgia. The team dynamics were strained from the start. 3 combat veterans and 1 apparent amateur made for an uncomfortable grouping. "Great," Brennan muttered as they reviewed their map coordinates. "We got stuck with the boot-tying brigade." Chen spread the topographical map across a fallen log, tracing potential routes with his finger. "Extraction point is here, 28 miles northeast. The terrain looks rough, multiple ridge lines, at least 3 river crossings, and this section here shows swampland." Williams checked her compass and calculated bearing. "Standard route would take us along the valley floor, following the main creek. Probably 36 hours of steady movement with rest stops." Rebecca studied the map quietly, her finger following different contour lines. The others noticed her concentrated expression, but assumed she was struggling to understand the terrain features. They had seen her confusion during previous land navigation exercises. "Any thoughts, Martinez?" Chen asked, more out of politeness than genuine interest in her opinion. Rebecca pointed to a seemingly impossible path that cut directly through the steepest terrain. "What about this route? Crosses 3 ridgelines but cuts 12 miles off the distance. These elevation markers suggest there might be game trails along the ridge spines." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Are you serious? That's almost vertical in some sections. We'd kill ourselves trying to climb those slopes. Actually, Rebecca continued, her voice gaining confidence, the ridge route avoids the swampland entirely. These contour lines indicate the eastern faces have gentler grades, and if we time it right, we could use thermal currents for signaling if we run into trouble. The 3 veterans exchanged glances. Rebecca's analysis was sophisticated, demonstrating understanding of advanced wilderness navigation that went far beyond her apparent skill level. Chen looked at the map again, reconsidering the route she had suggested. "How do you know about thermal currents and signal techniques?" Williams asked suspiciously. Rebecca's confidence seemed to evaporate instantly. I read about it somewhere, probably wrong anyway." But Chen had spent enough time in mountainous terrain to recognize sound tactical thinking. "No, you're right about the thermal patterns, and these ridge lines would give us better visibility for the final approach." They decided to follow Rebecca's suggested route, though her teammates remained skeptical about her ability to handle the challenging terrain. The first day proved their concerns justified. While climbing the initial ridge, Rebecca fell behind almost immediately. Her pack seemed to weigh her down more than the others, and she struggled with basic rock scrambling techniques that the veterans handled effortlessly. Yet, something strange began happening as they gained elevation. Rebecca's movements became more fluid, more confident. She began pointing out handholds and secure footing that others had missed. When they reached a particularly treacherous section where loose shale made every step dangerous, she found a route that seemed impossible but proved completely secure. "How did you know that ledge would hold our weight?" Chen asked as they reached the first summit. Rebecca looked genuinely confused by her own success. Lucky guess? The second day brought more mysteries. As they descended into a narrow valley, Rebecca suddenly stopped and held up her hand for silence. The others froze, listening for whatever had caught her attention. After 30 seconds of hearing nothing, Brennan started to move forward. "Wait," Rebecca whispered, "something's wrong." She led them around a seemingly innocent clearing, taking a circuitous route that added 20 minutes to their travel time. Williams was about to protest when they reached higher ground and looked back. The clearing they had avoided was actually a marsh covered with a thin layer of vegetation, a natural trap that could have swallowed a person whole. "Jesus," Brennan muttered. "How did you know?" Rebecca stared at the hidden marsh with an expression of surprise that seemed genuine. The plants were wrong, different shades of green. Usually it means water underneath. But her explanation didn't account for the certainty with which she had detected the danger or the precision of her alternative route. Chen began watching her more carefully, noting small behaviors that suggested experience she claimed not to have. During their second night, as temperatures dropped into the 30s and mountain winds made shelter critical, Rebecca constructed a lean-to that impressed all three veterans. The structure was perfectly positioned to block prevailing winds while capturing maximum heat from their small fire. Her knots were flawless, her material selection optimal, and her understanding of cold weather survival techniques was textbook perfect. "Where did you learn wilderness survival?" Williams asked directly. Rebecca replied, but her hands continued working with the practiced efficiency of someone who had built similar shelters dozens of times before. The third day brought their greatest challenge. Heavy rain had turned the final ridge approach into a series of muddy switchbacks that challenged even experienced climbers. Rebecca struggled visibly during the ascent, falling several times and requiring assistance from her teammates. But when they reached a section where the trail had been completely washed away by recent storms, leaving only a narrow ledge with a 100-foot drop, she suddenly took the lead. Her movement across the dangerous traverse was textbook mountaineering, precise foot placement, perfect weight distribution, and confident use of minimal handholds. She crossed first, then established an anchor point and guided the others across with professional-level rope work. "Where the hell did you learn to do that?" Brennan demanded once they were all safely across. Rebecca looked at the rope in her hands as if seeing it for the first time. "I don't know. It just seemed logical." They reached the extraction point with 6 hours to spare, having completed one of the most challenging routes possible in record time. Master Sergeant Coleman was waiting at the pickup coordinates with a GPS tracker that had monitored their progress. "Interesting route choice," he commented as they approached. "Most teams take the valley floor, slower but safer." "Martinez suggested the ridge route," Chen reported. "Saved us about 12 hours. Coleman looked at Rebecca with renewed interest. Her uniform was mud-stained and torn. Her face showed the exhaustion of 3 days in harsh conditions, but her eyes held a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Back at Camp Davidson, word of Rebecca's performance during survival training began to change how others perceived her. The woman who couldn't tie her boots had somehow guided 3 combat veterans through expert-level wilderness navigation. Her tactical suggestions had proved not just sound, but superior to conventional approaches. But the morning routine remained unchanged. Rebecca still struggled with her bootlaces, still fell behind during physical training, still seemed overwhelmed by basic military tasks that others handled instinctively. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. Master Sergeant Coleman found himself conducting unofficial background checks on Rebecca Martinez. Her personnel file was surprisingly thin for someone assigned to Special Forces assessment. Born in Phoenix, Arizona, previous employment listed as federal contractor. No military service record prior to enlisting 8 months ago. No college degrees or specialized training certificates.
What bothered Coleman most was what wasn't in her file. No emergency contacts beyond a generic address in Phoenix. No references from previous employers. No detailed background investigation notes that were standard for Special Forces candidates. It was as if Rebecca Martinez had materialized from nowhere 8 months ago with just enough credentials to qualify for military service. During the 6th week, training shifted to close-quarters combat and urban warfare scenarios. The exercises were designed to simulate real-world special operations missions, complete with live ammunition, simulated explosives, and role-playing civilians. The margin for error was minimal, and candidates who couldn't handle the pressure were removed immediately. Rebecca's first few exercises were disasters. She moved too slowly through building clearances, hesitated at critical moments, and seemed overwhelmed by the chaos of simulated combat. Other candidates began openly questioning whether she should be allowed to continue, worried that her presence endangered everyone involved. Then came the hostage rescue scenario that would change everything. The setup involved a three-story building with multiple rooms, hidden passages, and civilians mixed among hostile forces. Previous teams had either failed to locate all the hostages or had caused too many civilian casualties to pass the exercise. Rebecca's team was the last to attempt the scenario, and expectations were low. As they approached the building, Rebecca suddenly stopped and studied the structure with intense concentration. She walked around the entire perimeter, examining windows, fire escapes, and utility connections with the methodical precision of an expert. "What are you looking for?" Williams asked. "Sightlines," Rebecca replied, "entry points, structural weaknesses." Her analysis was comprehensive and professional. She identified 3 potential breach points that other teams had missed, calculated fields of fire for defensive positions, and noted architectural features that could be used for tactical advantage. When she finished, she presented a complete operational plan that impressed even Master Sergeant Coleman, who was observing from the control room. The execution was flawless. Rebecca moved through the building with the fluid precision of an experienced operator. She cleared rooms with textbook technique, identified threats instantly, and navigated the complex layout as if she had memorized it. Her team followed her lead, trusting her judgment even when her direction seemed counterintuitive. They located all 6 hostages, neutralized every threat, and achieved 0 civilian casualties. Their time was the fastest recorded for the exercise, and their tactical approach was so sophisticated that Coleman immediately requested video review to understand how they had succeeded where others failed. "Martinez," Coleman called as the team exited the building, "I need to speak with you privately." They walked to his office in silence, Coleman's mind racing with questions that demanded answers. Rebecca's performance had been too perfect, too professional, too confident for someone with her supposed background. The woman who struggled with bootlaces had just executed a hostage rescue with the skill of a seasoned special operations veteran. Coleman closed his office door and faced Rebecca directly. "I've been training special forces candidates for over 20 years. I can recognize natural talent when I see it, and I can spot previous training even when someone tries to hide it. What I can't figure out is why someone with your obvious experience is pretending to be a complete amateur." Rebecca's composure remained steady, but Coleman caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Calculation, perhaps, or resignation. "I don't know what you mean, Sergeant. I'm just trying to do my best." "Your best," Coleman pulled out the video footage from the exercise. "This isn't someone doing their best. This is someone who has done this exact type of operation before, multiple times, at a professional level. Your movement patterns, your threat assessment, your tactical decision-making, all of it shows experience that's not in your file." He paused, studying her face for any sign of admission. "I'm going to give you one chance to tell me the truth, Martinez, because tomorrow morning I'm going to search every inch of your personal belongings until I find out who you really are." That night, Rebecca Martinez sat on her bunk staring at her locker. The metal door seemed heavier than usual, weighted with secrets she had carried for 8 months. Around her, other candidates slept the exhausted sleep of warriors pushed to their limits. In a few hours, Master Sergeant Coleman would make good on his promise to search her belongings. She had known this moment would come eventually. The carefully constructed facade of Rebecca Martinez, a struggling recruit, was crumbling under the weight of instincts and training that ran too deep to completely suppress. Every tactical decision, every moment of expertise that slipped through her amateur disguise brought her closer to this inevitable confrontation. Rebecca opened her footlocker with trembling fingers. Beneath regulation uniforms, personal hygiene items, and standard-issue equipment lay a small locked metal box. Inside that box was everything Master Sergeant Coleman needed to understand why the woman who couldn't tie her boots had just executed a perfect hostage rescue. Dawn came too quickly. Coleman arrived at the barracks at 05:30, earlier than usual, carrying a clipboard and wearing the expression of a man determined to solve a puzzle that had been keeping him awake at night. The other candidates were already up, preparing for morning physical training, but Rebecca remained seated on her bunk. Martinez, Coleman's voice carried the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate and resigned. "Yes, Sergeant." They walked to his locker in silence, the weight of unspoken questions filling the space between them. Other candidates pretended not to watch, but Coleman could feel their curious attention as he prepared to search through Rebecca's personal effects. "Open it," he commanded. Rebecca's hands were steady as she worked the combination lock. The mechanism clicked open with finality that seemed to echo through the barracks. She stepped back, allowing Coleman full access to her belongings. He began methodically, checking pockets of uniforms, examining books and personal items for hidden compartments or concealed documents. Standard searches had become routine over his career, but this felt different. He was looking for evidence of a lie that had persisted for months.
Coleman lifted out regulation clothing, basic toiletries, and standard issue equipment. Everything appeared normal until his fingers found the metal box at the bottom of the footlocker. It was heavier than its size suggested, secured with a combination lock Rebecca had not mentioned. "What's in here?" he asked, holding up the box. Rebecca's composure finally cracked. Her shoulders sagged slightly, and she closed her eyes as if preparing for inevitable pain. "My life before this place." "Open it." She entered the combination with the mechanical precision of someone who had done so countless times. The lock clicked open, and she handed the box back to Coleman without meeting his eyes. Inside, wrapped in protective cloth, was a medal that made Coleman's breath catch in his throat. The distinctive blue ribbon and bronze star of the Navy Cross lay nestled against a collection of documents that told a story completely at odds with Rebecca Martinez's personnel file. Coleman lifted the medal carefully, recognizing immediately what he was holding. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. It was earned, not given, and never awarded lightly. The name engraved on the back read, "Captain Elena Rodriguez, United States Navy SEALs." "Captain Rodriguez," Coleman said quietly, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. Navy SEALs. The woman he had known as Rebecca Martinez nodded slowly. "Retired, supposedly." Coleman examined the documents beneath the medal. Service record for Captain Elena Rodriguez showed 12 years of distinguished service with Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the most elite unit in the Navy SEAL community. Combat deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and classified locations. Multiple commendations for valor. Leadership roles in operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. The Navy Cross, Coleman continued, reading from the citation, awarded for extraordinary heroism during a classified operation in Syria, single-handedly eliminated 12 enemy combatants while protecting wounded teammates during a 6-hour firefight. Elena's voice was barely above a whisper. "March 15th, 3 years ago. We were supposed to extract a high-value target, but it was a trap. My team was pinned down in a building surrounded by hostiles. I created a diversion, fought my way through their positions, and held them off until extraction arrived." Coleman found photographs tucked beneath the documents. Elena Rodriguez in full combat gear, standing with her SEAL team. The confident, hardened warrior in the images bore little resemblance to the struggling recruit he had been training. Yet now that he looked carefully, the bone structure was the same, the eyes identical despite the different expressions they carried. "Why?" Coleman asked. "Why leave all this behind to start over as a basic recruit?" Elena sat heavily on her bunk, the weight of hidden truth finally overwhelming her carefully maintained facade. "Because Captain Elena Rodriguez died in that building in Syria, even though her body walked away." She stared at her hands, the same hands that had struggled with bootlaces for 6 weeks. The mission was a success by official metrics. Target eliminated, team extracted, minimal casualties. But I lost something in that firefight that I couldn't explain in debriefs or casualty reports. Coleman waited, recognizing the look of someone preparing to share trauma that had been carried alone for too long. It wasn't just the combat, Elena continued. I've been in firefights before, lost teammates before. This was different. For 6 hours, I was someone else, someone who could do things that should have been impossible. I moved through that building like I was invincible, like bullets couldn't touch me. I made decisions without thinking and reacted to threats before I could see them. She paused, struggling to find words for an experience that defied explanation. When it was over, when we were back at base, I couldn't remember details of what I had done. My teammates described actions that sounded like someone else's memories. The medal citation lists achievements that feel like reading about a stranger. Coleman began to understand. Post-traumatic stress? No, Elena shook her head. Something else. Something that made me question who I was becoming. The woman who walked out of that building wasn't the same person who had entered. She was harder, colder, more efficient at violence than anyone should be. The revelation explained everything. The tactical expertise that emerged under pressure, the wilderness navigation skills that seemed to activate automatically, the perfect execution of the hostage rescue when muscle memory took over conscious thought. I tried to continue serving, Elena continued, but every mission brought out more of this other version of myself. My commanding officers praised my increased effectiveness, recommended me for more dangerous assignments. They saw improvement where I saw loss of humanity. Coleman examined the discharge papers. Honorable discharge, medical reasons. But you were cleared for full duty according to these psychological evaluations. I convinced the psychiatrists I was fine, told them what they needed to hear to approve my release. The truth was too complicated to explain. Elena looked up at Coleman for the first time since opening the box. How do you tell people that you're afraid of your own competence, that you've become too good at killing? The barracks had fallen silent around them. Other candidates had left for morning training, leaving Elena and Coleman alone with revelations that recontextualized everything that had happened over the past 6 weeks. So you created Rebecca Martinez, Coleman said, understanding the full scope of her deception. New identity, new background, new chance to discover who I could be without the weight of what I had done. I wanted to see if I could learn to be normal again, to struggle with simple tasks like everyone else, to fail at things without meaning life or death. Coleman studied the metal again, its bronze surface reflecting morning light streaming through the barracks windows. The bootlaces. Elena actually smiled for the first time since he had known her. Psychological resistance, subconscious sabotage. I was trying so hard to be incompetent that I couldn't even tie my boots properly. But under pressure, when lives were at stake, even simulated ones, the training took over.
The wilderness exercise, the hostage rescue, Coleman continued, pieces falling into place. You weren't pretending to have expertise, you were pretending not to have it. Exactly. I came here hoping that if I started over from the beginning, maybe I could find a middle ground. Someone who could be competent without being deadly, skilled without being ruthless. Coleman sat down across from her, the weight of command decisions pressing on his shoulders. Elena Rodriguez represented everything the Special Forces selection course was designed to identify: natural leadership, tactical excellence, proven combat effectiveness. She was exactly the type of candidate the program needed. But Rebecca Martinez represented something else entirely: the human cost of creating perfect warriors, the psychological toll of asking people to become more efficient killers than nature intended. What happens now? Elena asked. Coleman looked at the medal, the documents, the photographs of a woman who had earned the highest honors her country could bestow. Then he looked at the struggling recruit who had been trying to forget those achievements. That depends, he said carefully. Do you want to be Captain Elena Rodriguez again? Because I can make some phone calls and you'll be back in special operations within a week. Your skills are exactly what this country needs. Elena shook her head immediately. I can't go back to that. I won't. Then what do you want? For the first time in months, Elena considered the question seriously.
She had spent so long trying to escape her past that she hadn't thought about what kind of future she actually wanted. I want to find a way to use what I learned without becoming what I was. I want to help train people without teaching them to lose their humanity the way I did. I want to serve without sacrificing who I am. Coleman nodded slowly, understanding more than Elena realized. He had seen similar struggles in other elite operators who had pushed themselves beyond normal human limitations. The best warriors often paid the highest personal costs for their effectiveness. "I might have a solution," he said finally, "but it would require you to stop running from Elena Rodriguez and start integrating her with Rebecca Martinez." Elena looked at him with cautious hope. "What kind of solution?" "Instructor position, training the next generation of Special Forces candidates. You'd need to be honest about your background, but you'd be helping others learn from your experience rather than repeating your mistakes." The proposal hung between them like a lifeline thrown across an impossible chasm. Elena could see the possibility of redemption in Coleman's offer, a way to use her skills for something other than violence, to guide others away from the psychological traps that had nearly destroyed her. "I'd have to tell them everything," she said. "Everything," Coleman confirmed, "the good, the bad, and the complicated. These candidates deserve instructors who understand the real cost of what they're training to become." Elena looked at the Navy Cross in Coleman's hands, seeing it clearly for the first time in 3 years. It wasn't just a medal for heroism. It was evidence of a moment when she had transcended normal human limitations and paid a price that almost cost her soul. "All right," she said quietly, "but I keep the name Rebecca Martinez for now. Elena Rodriguez can be part of the story, but she doesn't need to be the whole story." Coleman smiled and carefully placed the medal back in its protective cloth. "Deal, but first, you're going to teach me how someone with your qualifications managed to struggle with bootlaces for 6 weeks." For the first time since arriving at Camp Davidson, Rebecca Martinez laughed genuinely. "Sergeant, that's going to require a much longer conversation." The news of Rebecca Martinez's true identity spread through Camp Davidson like wildfire, but not in the way either she or Master Sergeant Coleman had expected. Instead of shock or betrayal, the revelation triggered something entirely different among the remaining candidates: respect mixed with a profound understanding of why someone would walk away from glory to find themselves again. Tommy Brennan was the first to approach her after Coleman made the official announcement to the remaining 22 candidates. The Texas football player who had complained most loudly about her boot-tying struggles stood before her with an expression of genuine humility. "Ma'am," he began, then caught himself. "Rebecca, I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you about 100 apologies." Rebecca shook her head. "You don't owe me anything, Tommy. You reacted to what you saw, and what you saw was someone who couldn't handle basic tasks. You weren't wrong." "But I was wrong about why," Brennan insisted. "I thought you were incompetent. Turns out you were fighting a war inside your own head, trying to figure out how to be human again. That's harder than anything we've done here." Marcus Chen and Sarah Williams joined the conversation, both wearing expressions of newfound understanding. Chen had spent sleepless nights wondering how someone with Rebecca's tactical insights could struggle with fundamental military skills. Williams had questioned whether she belonged in the same program as someone who seemed so unprepared for elite training. "The survival exercise," Chen said quietly, "you knew exactly where we were going and how to get there. You could have led us on a perfect route from the beginning, but you held back." "I was trying to let you learn," Rebecca replied. "Part of me wanted to take charge, plan everything, control every variable, but that's not who I wanted to be anymore." Williams studied Rebecca's face, seeing past the facade that had fooled them all for weeks. "The hostage rescue wasn't an accident, was it? You let your training take over because lives were at stake." "Even simulated lives," Rebecca confirmed. "I couldn't let anyone get hurt, even in an exercise. Some instincts run too deep to suppress." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Patricia Hayes, Camp Davidson's commanding officer. Hayes had driven down from headquarters immediately after receiving Coleman's report, bringing with her a file that would complicate Rebecca's situation in ways none of them had anticipated.
"Captain Rodriguez," Hayes said formally,
using Elena's real rank for the first time in months. "We need to discuss your current status." They walked to Hayes's temporary office, leaving the other candidates to process revelations that challenged everything they thought they knew about strength, weakness, and the hidden costs of military service. Hayes closed the door and spread several documents across her desk. "Your discharge papers have been under review for the past 6 months. There are some irregularities that require clarification." Rebecca felt her stomach drop. She had been careful to ensure all paperwork was properly filed, all procedures correctly followed. What kind of irregularities? "The kind that suggests Captain Elena Rodriguez may not have been legally discharged from active duty," Hayes replied carefully. "Your medical evaluation was conducted by a Navy psychiatrist who has since been investigated for approving discharges without proper assessment. Several of his cases are being reviewed." The implications hit Rebecca like a physical blow. If her discharge was invalid, she was technically AWOL from the Navy SEALs. Military justice for absent without leave could range from administrative punishment to court-martial, depending on circumstances and duration. "However," Hayes continued, "there are mitigating factors. Your commanding officer at the time, Admiral Catherine Morrison, has submitted a letter stating that she was aware of your psychological condition and supported your decision to seek alternative treatment. She's recommended that your discharge be approved retroactively." Rebecca felt a wave of gratitude toward Admiral Morrison, a woman who had understood the hidden costs of creating perfect warriors better than most. Morrison had seen too many elite operators burn out, break down, or lose themselves in the pursuit of tactical excellence. "What does that mean for my current situation?" Rebecca asked. Hayes pulled out another document. "You have 3 options. First, you can accept retroactive discharge approval and continue as Rebecca Martinez, civilian. Second, you can return to active duty as Captain Rodriguez with the Navy SEALs. Third, you can accept a lateral transfer to Army Special Forces as an instructor, maintaining your rank and benefits while transitioning to a training role." The third option was exactly what Coleman had suggested, but hearing it presented as official policy made it feel both more real and more daunting. Rebecca would be responsible for shaping the next generation of Special Forces operators, helping them develop skills while avoiding the psychological traps that had nearly destroyed her. "I need time to consider this," Rebecca said. "You have 48 hours," Hayes replied. "But I should mention that your presence here has already had an impact beyond your personal situation." Hayes opened a final file containing reports from instructors throughout Camp Davidson. "Candidate performance has improved dramatically since your identity was revealed. Your teammates' scores on tactical assessments have increased by an average of 30%. Other candidates are asking more thoughtful questions about the psychological aspects of special operations training." The revelation surprised Rebecca. She had assumed her deception would damage trust and undermine the training environment. Instead, it seemed to have opened conversations about topics that were rarely discussed openly in military settings. "Why?" Rebecca asked. "Because you've given them permission to admit that being elite doesn't mean being invulnerable," Hayes explained. "For weeks, they watched someone struggle with basic tasks while excelling at complex ones. Now they understand that strength and weakness aren't opposites. They're parts of the same complicated human experience." That evening, Rebecca found herself sitting alone in the barracks, staring at the Navy Cross that now lay openly on her bunk. The medal felt different now that her secret was revealed, lighter somehow, as if the weight of hidden shame had been lifted along with the burden of deception. Coleman approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about complex problems. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Rebecca gestured to the empty bunk across from hers. "Please." Coleman handed her one of the coffee cups and settled into a comfortable silence before speaking. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about losing your humanity, becoming too good at violence." Rebecca waited, recognizing the tone of someone working through difficult ideas. "I've trained hundreds of candidates over the years," Coleman continued, The best ones all struggle with the same question. How do you become deadly enough to protect innocent people without becoming the kind of person who threatens innocent people? It was a question Rebecca had wrestled with throughout her military career, but hearing it articulated so clearly by someone else brought unexpected relief. She wasn't alone in recognizing the paradox at the heart of elite military training. Most of them find a balance, Coleman continued. They learn to compartmentalize, to turn their skills on and off as needed. But some, the very best ones, push themselves so far past normal human limitations that they can't find their way back. Rebecca nodded, understanding immediately. I became too efficient. Every problem looked like something that could be solved with violence. Every threat seemed to require overwhelming response. The Syria mission, Coleman said carefully. You didn't just save your team. You proved to yourself that you could transcend normal human capabilities when necessary. That's dangerous knowledge to carry. Rebecca took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth ground her in the present moment. I started seeing civilians as potential threats, allies as potential liabilities. Everything became tactical, calculated, measured in terms of operational advantage. And that's when you knew you had to stop. That's when I knew that Captain Elena Rodriguez had become someone I didn't want to be, even if she was everything the military wanted her to be.
Coleman leaned forward, his expression serious. But what if there was a way to use Elena Rodriguez's capabilities without becoming her again? What if you could teach others to recognize the warning signs you missed? The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus Chen, who approached hesitantly, carrying a notebook filled with handwritten questions. "Sorry to interrupt," Chen said, "but some of us have been talking, and we have questions about, well, about everything." Rebecca looked at Coleman, who nodded encouragingly. "What kind of questions?" Chen sat down on the floor, opening his notebook. "Tactical stuff, mostly, but also personal things. How do you know when you're pushing too hard? How do you stay connected to who you were before training changed you? How do you use these skills without letting them define you?" Other candidates began emerging from their bunks, drawn by the unusual sight of open conversation about topics that were typically avoided in military settings. Tommy Brennan sat down next to Chen, followed by Sarah Williams and eventually most of the remaining candidates. What developed over the next 2 hours was unlike any discussion that had ever taken place at Camp Davidson. Rebecca found herself answering questions about the psychological challenges of elite operations, the difficulty of maintaining personal relationships while carrying classified experiences, and the long-term mental health implications of training designed to override normal human inhibitions. "The bootlaces," Williams asked eventually, "was that really just psychological resistance?" Rebecca laughed, the sound genuine and relaxed for the first time in months. "Partly, but also practical. I was trying to relearn basic motor skills without relying on muscle memory that was trained for combat efficiency. Every simple task became an exercise in being deliberately imperfect." "But why?" Brennan asked. "Why choose to be worse at things when you could be better?" Rebecca considered the question carefully. "Because better isn't always healthier. Elena Rodriguez could field strip a weapon blindfolded in 30 seconds, but she also couldn't enjoy a meal without scanning for escape routes. She could neutralize threats before most people could recognize them, but she couldn't sit through a movie without tactical analysis of every scene." The candidates absorbed this information with the intensity of students receiving crucial instruction. They were learning something not taught in any manual, that elite capability came with hidden costs that extended far beyond physical risk. "So what's the answer?" Chen asked. "How do you develop the skills we need without losing yourself in the process?" Rebecca looked around at the group of young warriors, seeing in their faces the same hunger for excellence that had driven her own military career. They deserved honest answers, even if those answers were complicated. "I don't know," she admitted. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. But I think it starts with acknowledging that the question matters. Most military training focuses on capability development without addressing psychological sustainability.
We teach people to be more effective without teaching them to remain human. Coleman had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. This is exactly why we need instructors who understand both sides of that equation, people who have pushed themselves to the edge and found their way back. Rebecca felt the weight of decisions settling on her shoulders. The conversations with candidates had shown her something she hadn't expected, that her experience with the dark side of elite training could serve a purpose beyond her own healing. She could help others navigate challenges that were rarely acknowledged, let alone addressed. Colonel Hayes gave me 48 hours to decide about the instructor position, but I think I already know my answer. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, young soldiers who were willing to risk everything in service of their country, but who deserved to understand all the risks they were accepting. I want to help train people who can do impossible things when necessary, but who remember why those things should remain impossible under normal circumstances. I want to teach tactical excellence without tactical obsession, capability without losing compassion. Coleman smiled. That sounds like a mission statement for a new kind of military instructor. Rebecca picked up the Navy Cross, feeling its weight differently than she had for the past 3 years. Instead of a burden of guilt or a reminder of lost humanity, it had become a tool for teaching others about the true costs and benefits of extraordinary service. Captain Elena Rodriguez earned this medal, she said quietly, but Rebecca Martinez is going to figure out what to do with the lessons it represents. The decision felt right in ways that going back to combat operations never could have. She would serve her country again, but this time as someone who understood that creating a League Warriors required more than physical and tactical training. It required helping them maintain their humanity, even as they develop capabilities that transcend normal human limitations. 6 months after the revelation at Camp Davidson, Captain Rebecca Martinez stood before her first official class of Special Forces candidates. The name on her uniform read Martinez, but her personnel file now included the complete service record of Elena Rodriguez. She had chosen to keep the name that represented her journey toward wholeness rather than returning to the identity that had nearly broken her. The classroom at Fort Liberty was different from the training facilities at Camp Davidson. Instead of obstacle courses and shooting ranges, this room was equipped with whiteboards, comfortable seating, and an atmosphere designed for deep thinking rather than physical endurance. Rebecca's role as Chief Instructor for Psychological Resilience in Special Operations was a newly created position born from recognition that elite military units needed better preparation for the mental challenges of their missions. 24 candidates sat before her, all veterans of initial Special Forces training who had been selected for advanced instruction. Unlike the recruits she had trained alongside at Camp Davidson, these were experienced operators who had already proven their tactical competence. They were here to learn something more complex, how to maintain their humanity while performing inhuman tasks. "Before we begin," Rebecca said, placing her Navy Cross on the podium where everyone could see it, "I want you to understand why this medal both qualifies and disqualifies me to teach this course." The candidates leaned forward with interest. Most had heard rumors about the instructor who had hidden her identity during Special Forces selection, but few knew the complete story. 3 years ago, I earned this medal during a 6-hour firefight in Syria. The citation describes extraordinary heroism, tactical brilliance, and life-saving actions under impossible circumstances. All of that is true. Rebecca paused, letting the weight of those achievements settle in the room. What the citation doesn't mention is that the person who earned this medal was someone I no longer recognized as myself. She was efficient, ruthless, and completely disconnected from normal human emotion. She could make life-and-death decisions without hesitation, but she couldn't have a conversation with her own family without calculating threat assessments. The room remained silent, but Rebecca could see recognition in several faces. These were operators who had walked similar paths, who understood the gradual transformation that could occur when violence became routine. This course exists because the military has learned to create elite warriors faster than we've learned to help them remain whole human beings. You're here because someone has recognized that your psychological well-being is just as important as your tactical capabilities. Rebecca began walking among the desks, making eye contact with each candidate. Over the next 8 weeks, we're going to discuss things that military training traditionally ignores: how to process trauma in healthy ways, how to maintain personal relationships despite classified experiences, how to recognize when your capabilities are becoming destructive to yourself or others. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, a Green Beret with 4 combat deployments, raised his hand. "Ma'am, with respect, how does talking about feelings make us better soldiers?" Rebecca smiled, recognizing the skepticism that was natural among operators trained to value action over introspection. "Sergeant Torres, how many hours of weapons training do you complete each month?" "Approximately 40 hours, ma'am." "And how many hours of tactical planning and scenario exercises?" "Maybe 60 hours." "And how many hours do you spend learning to process the psychological impact of using those weapons and tactics against other human beings?" Torres considered the question. "None, officially." "That's the problem," Rebecca explained. "We train your bodies and minds to operate at superhuman levels, but we provide no training for the human soul that has to carry the weight of those operations." She returned to the front of the classroom and pulled up a slide showing brain scans. These images compare the neural activity of special operations veterans with that of civilian populations. Notice the differences in areas associated with emotional regulation, threat assessment, and social bonding. The scans showed clear distinctions. The operators' brains displayed heightened activity in regions associated with constant vigilance and threat detection, while showing decreased activity in areas related to relaxation and social connection. "Your training has literally rewired your brains for enhanced tactical performance," Rebecca continued. "But without proper psychological maintenance, those changes can become maladaptive in civilian settings. You become hypervigilant in safe environments, socially isolated despite strong team bonds, and unable to experience normal human pleasures." Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a Navy SEAL, spoke up. "So we're damaged goods?" "No," Rebecca replied firmly. "You're high-performance athletes who need specialized maintenance. A Formula One race car requires different care than a family sedan, not because it's broken, but because it operates at levels that demand more sophisticated support." The analogy resonated with the group. These were people who understood the concept of specialized equipment requiring specialized maintenance. "The goal isn't to make you less capable," Rebecca continued. "It's to help you maintain your capabilities without losing your humanity. You can be elite warriors and whole human beings, but it requires intentional effort and specific skills." Over the following weeks, Rebecca introduced concepts that were revolutionary in military training circles. She taught meditation techniques specifically designed for combat veterans, communication strategies for maintaining relationships despite classified experiences, and recognition protocols for identifying when tactical thinking was becoming destructive to yourself or others. The breakthrough moment came during the 4th week when Sergeant Torres broke down while discussing his inability to connect with his own children. He had returned from his last deployment technically uninjured, but emotionally numb, unable to experience joy in activities that had once brought him happiness. "I can lead men through enemy territory, plan operations that save lives, neutralize threats most people can't even imagine," Torres said through tears. "But I can't sit through my daughter's piano recital without scanning the room for exits and calculating response times for emergency situations." Rebecca recognized the pain in his voice because she had lived it herself. "Michael, that hypervigilance kept you alive in hostile environments. The problem isn't that you developed those skills, it's that no one taught you how to turn them off when they're no longer needed." The room erupted in conversation as other candidates shared similar experiences. They discovered that problems they had assumed were personal failures were actually common responses to training designed to override normal human psychology. Rebecca introduced the concept of tactical switching, consciously transitioning between operational mode and civilian mode based on environmental requirements. Like learning to speak different languages for different situations, operators could learn to activate different psychological modes as circumstances demanded. Elena Rodriguez was trapped in permanent operational mode. She couldn't distinguish between combat environments and safe spaces because she had never learned to make that transition consciously. The training involved practical exercises that seemed almost comically simple to outside observers, but were revolutionary for special operations personnel. Candidates practiced eating meals without threat assessment, watching movies without tactical analysis, and having conversations without intelligence-gathering objectives. Lieutenant Kim struggled with the movie exercise, finding herself unable to enjoy entertainment without analyzing character motivations for deception or studying camera angles for defensive positions. "This feels impossible," she admitted after attempting to watch a romantic comedy without operational thinking. "Start smaller," Rebecca suggested. "Watch for 5 minutes, then 10. Gradually increase your tolerance for non-tactical entertainment. Think of it as training your brain the same way you'd train any other muscle." The progress was gradual but remarkable. Torres began reporting improved relationships with his family as he learned to consciously shift from operational mode to father mode when arriving home. Kim developed techniques for enjoying civilian activities without losing her tactical edge when needed. But the most significant development occurred when the candidates began supporting each other through psychological challenges with the same intensity they brought to combat missions. They formed study groups that met outside class hours to practice emotional regulation techniques, created accountability partnerships for maintaining work-life boundaries, and developed communication protocols for addressing mental health concerns within their teams. "This is what we've been missing," Torres observed during a group discussion. "We're trained to take care of each other physically, to never leave anyone behind in combat, but we were never taught to apply that same principle to psychological wellness." Rebecca felt a deep satisfaction watching these elite warriors extend their brotherhood to include emotional support. It represented exactly the kind of cultural shift she had hoped to inspire, treating psychological resilience as seriously as physical fitness or tactical proficiency. During the final week of the course, Rebecca assigned a project that challenged everything the candidates thought they knew about strength and vulnerability. Each person was required to identify someone in their personal life who had been negatively affected by their military service and make amends through honest conversation about their psychological struggles. The assignment terrified most participants. These were people trained to project invulnerability, to solve problems through action rather than discussion, to maintain operational security about their experiences. Admitting psychological struggles to family members felt more dangerous than combat operations. Torres chose to speak with his ex-wife, whose marriage had ended largely due to his emotional unavailability after returning from deployments. Kim reached out to her brother, who had stopped inviting her to family gatherings because her hypervigilance made everyone uncomfortable. The conversations were difficult but transformative. Torres discovered that his ex-wife had interpreted his emotional numbing as indifference toward their relationship, not understanding that it was a symptom of psychological protection mechanisms developed for survival. Kim learned that her family wanted to support her, but didn't know how to interact with someone who seemed constantly on guard against threats that didn't exist in civilian settings. "I never realized how my training was affecting people," Kim reported to the class. "I thought I was protecting them by maintaining distance, but I was actually isolating them from someone they loved." As the course concluded, Rebecca felt a sense of completion that had eluded her since leaving active duty. She had found a way to serve that honored both Elena Rodriguez's capabilities and Rebecca Martinez's humanity. The candidates were graduating with tools that could have prevented her own psychological crisis, equipped to maintain their elite status while preserving their human connections. Colonel Hayes attended the graduation ceremony, bringing news that would ensure Rebecca's program continued and expanded. "The preliminary results from your pilot course are remarkable," Hayes announced. "Graduates are showing improved family stability, reduced rates of substance abuse, and enhanced team cohesion. The Pentagon has approved funding for similar programs at special operations bases worldwide." Rebecca felt tears forming as she realized the scope of what they had accomplished.
The woman who had hidden in shame from her own capabilities was now teaching others to integrate those capabilities in healthy ways. Elena Rodriguez's painful experiences had become Rebecca Martinez's greatest asset in helping others avoid similar struggles. During the graduation dinner, Sergeant Torres approached Rebecca with an expression of gratitude that went beyond words. "Ma'am, you saved my life," he said simply. "Not the dramatic, medal-worthy kind of saving, the quiet, everyday kind that lets me actually live the life I've been protecting." Rebecca understood exactly what he meant. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that allow people to come home not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically as well. As she drove home that evening, Rebecca passed a billboard advertising military recruitment with images of heroic soldiers in dramatic combat poses. She smiled, knowing that the real heroism often happens in quiet moments, when warriors chose vulnerability over invulnerability, when they prioritized emotional connection over tactical advantage, when they recognized that true strength included the courage to remain fully human. The Navy Cross sat on her dashboard, no longer a burden of guilt, but a reminder of the journey that had led her to understand that the greatest service she could provide wasn't in perfecting the art of war, but in teaching warriors how to return home as whole human beings. Rebecca Martinez had finally learned how to tie her boots properly. But more importantly, she had learned that struggling with simple tasks didn't make her weak, it made her human. And in a world that desperately needed human solutions to inhuman problems, that was exactly what she was meant to be. 2 years after establishing the Psychological Resilience Program, Captain Rebecca Martinez received an unexpected visitor at Fort Liberty. Admiral Catherine Morrison, the commanding officer who had supported her discharge from the Navy SEALs, stood in Rebecca's office doorway with an expression that mixed pride with concern. "Captain Martinez," Admiral Morrison said, using Rebecca's chosen name with deliberate respect. "I've been following your work here. Impressive results across all metrics." Rebecca gestured for the Admiral to sit, surprised by the unannounced visit from someone of Morrison's rank. "Thank you, Admiral. The program has exceeded our initial projections." Morrison settled into the chair across from Rebecca's desk, her gaze taking in the office that perfectly embodied the balance Rebecca had achieved. Military efficiency coexisted with personal touches, family photos, books on psychology and philosophy, artwork created by program graduates who had rediscovered creative expression. "I'm here because we have a problem," Morrison began. "A significant one that requires your specific expertise." She pulled out a classified folder marked with security clearances that made Rebecca's pulse quicken. Operation Blackwater. Heard of it? Rebecca shook her head. Her security clearance for the Resilience Program didn't extend to active operations intelligence. 6 months ago, we deployed a special operations team to extract a high-value intelligence asset from a terrorist compound in Southeast Asia. The mission was successful by all tactical measures. Asset recovered, no friendly casualties, target eliminated. Morrison paused, her expression darkening. But the psychological cost has been catastrophic. The entire team has been experiencing what can only be described as collective psychological breakdown. Traditional counseling and medical intervention have been ineffective. Rebecca felt a chill of recognition. What kind of breakdown? Complete inability to function in civilian settings, extreme hypervigilance, social isolation, and most concerning, they've begun displaying signs of what psychologists are calling moral injury on a scale we've never encountered. Morrison opened the folder, revealing photographs and psychological evaluations that painted a disturbing picture. 8 elite operators, all with distinguished service records, had become unable to integrate back into normal military life, let alone civilian society. The mission required them to make choices that saved lives, but violated their fundamental moral frameworks, Morrison continued. They followed orders, completed objectives, and achieved strategic success, but the human cost of their actions has left them questioning everything they believe about themselves and their service. Rebecca studied the files, seeing patterns that were all too familiar. What kind of choices? Morrison's voice became carefully measured.
The terrorist compound was using civilian shields, families of workers, children. The team had to choose between mission success and civilian casualties. They chose mission success. The weight of that decision settled heavily in the room. Rebecca understood immediately why traditional counseling had failed. These operators weren't dealing with standard combat trauma. They were wrestling with actions that had saved American lives while ending innocent ones. "How many civilian casualties?" Rebecca asked quietly. 14, including 6 children. Rebecca closed her eyes, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied discussions of moral complexity in warfare. And the intelligence they recovered? Prevented a terrorist attack that would have killed hundreds, possibly thousands of American civilians. The mission was justified by any strategic analysis, but that doesn't help the team process what they had to do to achieve it. Morrison leaned forward, her expression intense. "I need you to work with them, Rebecca. You're the only person I know who has experience with the kind of psychological damage that comes from pushing human capabilities beyond human morality." Rebecca felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Where are they now? Isolated facility in Colorado. They've been removed from active duty pending psychological evaluation, but they're deteriorating rapidly. 2 have attempted suicide, 3 have complete psychological shutdown, and the others are displaying increasingly erratic behavior. The description triggered memories of Rebecca's own darkest period after Syria, when she had questioned whether Elena Rodriguez was someone worth saving. "What command do you want from me?" "Honestly, they want you to fix them so they can return to duty. The military has invested millions in their training, and their tactical expertise is irreplaceable." Morrison paused. "But I want something different. I want you to help them find a way to live with what they've done." Rebecca appreciated the distinction. Command saw broken equipment that needed repair. Morrison saw human beings who needed healing regardless of their future utility to military operations. "I'll need complete autonomy," Rebecca said. "No timeline pressure, no predetermined outcomes, and no interference from command structure." "Done. Whatever you need." Rebecca spent the flight to Colorado reviewing detailed files on each team member. Master Chief Petty Officer Daniel Park, team leader with 15 years of Navy SEAL experience. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, explosive ordnance specialist who had defused hundreds of bombs. Lieutenant Commander James Wilson, intelligence analyst who spoke 6 languages. Each file told the story of exceptional soldiers who had voluntarily accepted an impossible mission and were now paying an impossible price. The facility in Colorado looked more like a luxury retreat than a military installation. Set against the backdrop of snow-capped mountains, it was designed to provide healing environments for personnel dealing with classified psychological trauma. Rebecca arrived to find 8 of America's most elite warriors reduced to shadows of their former selves. Master Chief Park met her at the entrance, his movements mechanical and his eyes empty of the confidence that had once commanded respect in the most dangerous situations imaginable. "Captain Martinez, Admiral Morrison said you might be able to help us." Rebecca studied Park's face, seeing the telltale signs of someone carrying unbearable weight. "I'm here to listen, not to fix. There's a difference." The team had been living in isolation for months, cut off from family and friends due to the classified nature of their mission. They had become a closed unit, sharing trauma that no one else could understand, while slowly destroying each other with guilt and recrimination. Rebecca's first group session revealed the depth of their psychological damage. Staff Sergeant Santos spoke in monotone about her inability to sleep without seeing the faces of children who had died in the explosion she had triggered. Lieutenant Commander Wilson described calculating the mathematical certainty that civilian deaths were necessary for mission success, then being unable to perform basic arithmetic because numbers had become associated with human lives. "We did everything right," Park said during their third session. "We followed rules of engagement, minimized casualties where possible, and achieved strategic objectives that saved American lives. But none of that matters when you close your eyes and see what we saw." Rebecca recognized the fundamental problem immediately. These operators had been trained to make tactical decisions, not moral ones. They had been given impossible choices and then expected to carry the weight of those choices without psychological support. The military teaches us to follow orders and complete missions, Rebecca said carefully. But it doesn't teach us how to live with the consequences of actions we never wanted to take. The breakthrough came during the second week, when Wilson broke down completely while describing his role in targeting calculations. "I knew exactly how many people would die," he sobbed. "I calculated blast radius, structural damage, and civilian proximity. I had all the numbers, and I reported them anyway because the mission required it." Rebecca let him cry, understanding that this was the first time he had allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had participated in. "James, you were asked to choose between terrible options. That doesn't make you a monster, it makes you human." "How do you live with being human when human choices result in dead children?" Wilson asked. It was the question Rebecca had wrestled with throughout her own crisis, and she still didn't have a complete answer. "I don't know if you ever fully live with it, but you can learn to carry it without letting it destroy everything else you are." The healing process was unlike anything in Rebecca's previous experience. These operators needed to process not just trauma, but moral injury. The specific psychological damage that occurs when someone is forced to act against their fundamental ethical beliefs in service of a greater good. Rebecca introduced concepts borrowed from philosophy, theology, and ethics rather than traditional military psychology. They discussed the doctrine of double effect, the trolley problem, and historical examples of moral complexity in warfare. The goal wasn't to justify their actions, but to provide frameworks for understanding the impossible situation they had faced. "You were asked to choose between two kinds of evil," Rebecca explained during a group session. "Allowing a terrorist attack that would kill hundreds of Americans, or taking actions that would kill innocent civilians to prevent that attack. There was no morally pure option available." Santos struggled with the concept. "But we could have refused the mission? And then what? The attack would have proceeded, more people would have died, and you would be carrying different guilt about lives you could have saved. You were trapped in a situation where any choice would result in moral injury." The team began to understand that their psychological damage wasn't a sign of weakness or moral failure. It was evidence that they retained their humanity despite being asked to act beyond normal human moral boundaries. Rebecca introduced them to the concept of moral resilience, the ability to act ethically under extreme circumstances while maintaining psychological health. Unlike tactical resilience, which focused on mission completion, moral resilience required accepting the full weight of necessary but ethically complex actions. You've maintained your humanity precisely because you can't convince yourselves that any justification makes civilian deaths acceptable. The distinction was crucial. These operators weren't broken because they had done something wrong. They were wounded because they had done something necessary that violated their core values, and that wound was evidence of their moral integrity. Progress was measured in small victories. Park began sleeping through the night without nightmares. Santos started eating regular meals again. Wilson resumed contact with his family, though he couldn't discuss the specifics of his mission. But the most significant development occurred when the team began supporting each other through moral complexity rather than tactical challenges. They created rituals for acknowledging the civilians who had died, established protocols for discussing ethical concerns about future missions, and developed support systems for processing moral injury as seriously as physical wounds. "We can't bring back the people who died," Park said during their final group session, "but we can honor them by refusing to let their deaths be meaningless. We prevented something worse, and we're going to carry the weight of that prevention for the rest of our lives." Rebecca felt deep satisfaction watching these warriors find a path forward that acknowledged both their tactical success and their moral struggle. They weren't healed in the traditional sense. They would always carry the weight of impossible choices. But they had learned to carry that weight without being crushed by it. Admiral Morrison visited during the final week of treatment, bringing news that would shape the future of military ethics training. "The Pentagon has been watching your work here," she told Rebecca. "They want to implement moral resilience training alongside tactical training for all special operations personnel." The proposal represented a fundamental shift in military thinking, acknowledging that elite operators needed preparation for moral complexity, not just tactical challenges. Rebecca's program would expand to address not just post-mission psychological care, but pre-mission ethical preparation. "They're also offering you a promotion to colonel and assignment as director of military ethics and psychological resilience," Morrison continued. "You'd be responsible for developing ethical training protocols for all special operations branches." Rebecca considered the offer carefully. It represented everything she had hoped to achieve: fundamental change in how the military prepared warriors for the psychological realities of modern warfare. "I accept," she said finally, "but with conditions. Moral resilience training becomes mandatory, not optional. Ethics consultation becomes available for mission planning, not just post-mission therapy. And we acknowledge that some psychological wounds are evidence of moral health, not signs of weakness." Morrison smiled. Already approved. The military is finally ready to admit that creating effective warriors requires more than tactical training. It requires preparing them to remain human under inhuman circumstances. As Rebecca prepared to leave Colorado, Master Chief Park approached her with a gift that symbolized the team's transformation. It was a framed photograph of the children who had died during their mission, along with a pledge signed by all team members to carry those memories forward as motivation for preventing future tragedies.
"We can't save these kids," Park said quietly, "but we can make sure their deaths contribute to something that prevents other children from dying. That's how we honor them, by becoming better at impossible choices." Rebecca understood that this team had found what she had been seeking since Syria, a way to integrate tactical capability with moral responsibility, to serve effectively while remaining fundamentally human. They would return to duty as more effective operators precisely because they had learned to process moral complexity rather than ignore it. The drive back to Fort Liberty gave Rebecca time to reflect on how far her journey had taken her. From Elena Rodriguez, who had hidden the moral complexity behind tactical efficiency, to Rebecca Martinez, who was now teaching others to embrace that complexity as part of their service. The woman who couldn't tie her boots had learned to help others navigate challenges far more complex than footwear. And in doing so, she had discovered that the greatest strength wasn't the ability to act without moral consideration. It was the courage to act morally, even when every option carried ethical costs. 5 years after that morning when Master Sergeant Coleman discovered a Navy cross hidden in a footlocker, Colonel Rebecca Martinez stood before the United Nations Security Council in New York City. The woman who had once struggled to tie her combat boots was now addressing world leaders about revolutionizing how nations prepare their warriors for the psychological realities of modern conflict. The invitation to speak had come from Secretary General Elena Vasquez, who had been following reports of dramatically reduced suicide rates and improved psychological outcomes among American Special Forces personnel. Countries around the world were dealing with epidemic levels of veteran suicide and post-combat psychological breakdown, and traditional approaches had proven inadequate. "Distinguished delegates," Rebecca began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had lived every lesson she taught. "We are here today because the way we prepare warriors for combat has not evolved to match the way combat has evolved to challenge warriors." The assembly hall was packed with military attachés, defense ministers, and mental health professionals from 47 nations. Rebecca's presentation would propose the first international standards for military psychological resilience training based on programs that had transformed American special operations culture. 5 years ago, I was a Navy SEAL captain who had become so psychologically damaged by elite training that I couldn't function in civilian society. Today, I oversee programs that have reduced special operations suicide rates by 68% and improved family stability among elite units by 73%. She clicked to the first slide, showing comparative data from before and after implementation of moral resilience training. The numbers were compelling, but Rebecca knew that statistics alone wouldn't convey the human transformation that those numbers represented. The traditional military approach treats psychological health as separate from tactical training. We prepare soldiers to be physically capable and tactically proficient, then address psychological issues as medical problems when they arise. This approach is fundamentally flawed because it ignores the integrated nature of human psychology and performance. Rebecca advanced to brain scan images showing the neurological differences between warriors trained with and without psychological resilience integration. Modern neuroscience proves that elite combat training literally rewires the brain. Without proper psychological preparation, this rewiring can become maladaptive in non-combat environments. General Anders Ericsson from Sweden leaned forward with interest. His country had been struggling with veteran integration issues despite having one of the world's most progressive military mental health programs. Colonel Martinez, Ericsson interrupted politely, "Your data is impressive, but how do we implement these concepts across different military cultures and traditions?" Rebecca had anticipated this question. "General, the principles are universal, but the implementation must be culturally specific. What works for American Special Forces might not work for Swedish peacekeepers or Japanese maritime self-defense forces." She clicked to a slide showing pilot programs from 12 different countries that had begun implementing adapted versions of her protocols. The core concept is teaching warriors to consciously transition between tactical mindset and civilian mindset based on environmental requirements. How that transition is taught depends entirely on cultural context. The presentation continued with case studies that had never been shared publicly before. Rebecca described the transformation of Master Chief Park's team from moral injury to moral resilience, the development of ethical decision-making frameworks for complex operations, and the creation of support systems that treated moral wounds as seriously as physical injuries. Ambassador Chen Wei raised a concern that had been echoed by several authoritarian representatives. "Colonel, doesn't this psychological training risk making soldiers less willing to follow orders, less committed to mission completion?" Rebecca had faced similar resistance from traditionalists within the American military establishment. "Ambassador Chen, our data shows the opposite. Warriors who understand the psychological cost of their actions are more effective, not less. They make better tactical decisions because they understand the full consequences of those decisions." She shared video testimonials from operators who had completed the integrated training programs. These weren't recruiting advertisements or propaganda pieces, but honest assessments from elite warriors discussing how psychological preparation had enhanced rather than hindered their tactical effectiveness. Staff Sergeant Santos appeared on screen, speaking directly to the camera. "Learning to process moral complexity didn't make me weaker, it made me more precise. When you understand the true cost of violence, you find ways to achieve objectives with minimal human cost. That's not weakness, that's advanced tactical thinking." The impact on the assembly was visible. These were representatives from nations that measured military effectiveness in terms of mission success rates and casualty minimization. Santos was describing how moral training improved both metrics simultaneously. Rebecca continued with economic arguments that resonated with defense budget planners. "The cost of treating psychological casualties after the fact far exceeds the cost of preventing them through proper preparation. Traditional post-combat therapy costs approximately $47,000 per veteran annually. Integrated psychological resilience training costs approximately $2,000 per soldier during initial training." The numbers were stark, but Rebecca knew that the real value couldn't be measured in dollars. She was talking about preserving the humanity of people asked to perform inhuman tasks in service of human values.
However, Rebecca continued, the most compelling argument isn't economic or tactical, it's moral. We have an ethical obligation to the warriors we sent into combat to prepare them for all aspects of that experience, not just the physical dangers. She clicked personal photographs that brought the abstract discussion into sharp human focus. Images of military families reunited after deployments, veterans successfully transitioning to civilian careers, special operations personnel maintaining healthy relationships despite classified work demands. These are the faces of psychological resilience, warriors who can serve effectively while remaining connected to the values they serve to protect. During the lunch break, Rebecca found herself surrounded by representatives asking detailed questions about implementation timelines, training requirements, and cultural adaptation protocols. The interest was genuine and widespread, crossing traditional geopolitical boundaries. General Maria Gonzalez from Spain approached with an urgency that surprised Rebecca. "Colonel, we have a situation developing that requires immediate consultation. May I speak with you privately?" They moved to a secure conference room where Gonzalez outlined a crisis that was unfolding in real time. A Spanish special operations team was currently deployed on a hostage rescue mission in West Africa, facing the same type of impossible moral choices that had devastated Park's team. Intelligence indicates that the terrorist group is using civilian shields, including children from local schools. Our team has the capability to complete the mission, but only with significant civilian casualties. They're requesting guidance on proceeding. Rebecca understood immediately. This was exactly the scenario her training programs were designed to address, not by providing easy answers, but by preparing operators to make complex decisions while maintaining psychological health. "General, do your operators have any training in moral decision-making frameworks?" "None, standard tactical training only." Rebecca felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with life-and-death consultations. "I need secure communication with your team commander immediately." The next hour proved to be the most intense field application of Rebecca's theories she had ever experienced. Via encrypted satellite communication, she guided the Spanish team through an abbreviated version of moral resilience protocols while they faced imminent tactical decisions. "Commander Rivera," Rebecca spoke into the secure handset, "you're facing a choice between two types of harm. Neither option is morally pure, but one serves the greater good while minimizing unnecessary suffering." Rivera's voice crackled through the connection. "Colonel, we can complete the mission, but civilian casualties are inevitable. How do we proceed without destroying ourselves psychologically?" "By acknowledging that you're being asked to bear a moral burden for the greater good, and that bearing that burden is part of your service. You're not becoming monsters, you're accepting responsibility for necessary evil to prevent greater evil." Rebecca guided them through rapid ethical analysis protocols, helping them identify the option that minimized total harm while achieving strategic objectives. More importantly, she prepared them psychologically to carry the weight of whatever actions they had to take. The mission succeeded with minimal civilian casualties, 3 deaths instead of the projected 15. Rivera's team achieved strategic objectives while maintaining psychological cohesion because they had been prepared to process moral complexity rather than ignore it. When Rebecca returned to the Security Council chamber that afternoon, news of the Spanish operation had reached several delegations. The real-time application of her theories under combat conditions had provided the most convincing demonstration of their practical value. Colonel Martinez, Secretary General Vasquez announced, "Based on this morning's presentation and this afternoon's successful field application, the Security Council is prepared to draft a resolution establishing international standards for military psychological resilience training." The proposal passed with overwhelming support, establishing the first global framework for preparing warriors to maintain psychological health while serving in complex operational environments. Rebecca had achieved something unprecedented, international recognition that warrior mental health was a strategic asset worthy of systematic development. As delegates filed out of the chamber, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From Elena Rodriguez hiding from her own capabilities to Rebecca Martinez teaching others to integrate those capabilities with their humanity.
to Colonel Martinez reshaping international military culture. Admiral Morrison approached as Rebecca gathered her materials. Elena would be proud, Morrison said quietly, using the name Rebecca had carried in her darkest moments. Elena was broken, Rebecca replied. Rebecca learned to heal. But Colonel Martinez, she's learned to prevent others from breaking in the first place. The flight back to Fort Liberty gave Rebecca time to process the magnitude of what had been accomplished. Her personal crisis became a professional mission which had evolved into institutional reform, which had now become international policy. The woman who couldn't tie her boots had helped reshape how the world prepares its warriors. But the most meaningful moment came during her return to Fort Liberty when she found a package waiting in her office. Inside was a pair of combat boots with a note from Master Chief Park's daughter, who had just enlisted in the Navy. Colonel Martinez, the note read, "My father told me about your boot-tying struggles and how they led to helping him find his way home. I wanted you to have these as a reminder that sometimes our weaknesses become our greatest strengths. These boots belonged to my father during his darkest period. He asked me to give them to you with his promise that no warrior trained under your programs will ever have to choose between tactical effectiveness and human decency." Rebecca laced up the boots carefully, taking her time with each eyelet. They fit perfectly, and for the first time in years, the simple act of tying bootlaces felt like a celebration rather than a struggle. She walked out to the training grounds where a new class of special operations candidates was beginning their psychological resilience training. These young warriors will learn from day one that elite capability and moral integrity weren't opposing forces. They were complementary aspects of true strength. Master Sergeant Coleman, now serving as Rebecca's senior instructor, approached with the easy confidence of someone who had watched impossible transformations become routine reality. "Ready for the next class, Colonel?" Rebecca looked at the eager faces of candidates who would never have to choose between being effective warriors and remaining whole human beings. They would face the same impossible situations that had broken previous generations of elite operators, but they would face them with tools Rebecca's generation had never possessed. "More than ready, Sergeant. Let's teach them how to tie their boots properly." Coleman laughed, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. They weren't just teaching footwear management, they were teaching the most important lesson any warrior could learn. That true strength meant choosing to remain human even when circumstances demanded superhuman actions. As Rebecca walked toward the classroom where her next group of students waited, she felt the weight of her Navy Cross in her pocket. Not the burden of guilt she had carried for so many years, but the responsibility of ensuring that future recipients would understand what Elena Rodriguez had taken so long to learn. That the greatest victories weren't won on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when warriors chose to come home as the same people they had been when they left. The woman who couldn't tie her boots had taught the world that sometimes struggling with simple tasks was exactly what made someone qualified to handle the most complex challenges imaginable. And in learning to help others with their struggles, she had finally learned to forgive herself for her own. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.